All right, in today's video, we're going to discuss parties to contracts and what those parties' legal name, what their legal names are. This actually comes to you by request. I've had several students over the past couple of weeks say, hey, can you kind of just put it all into a graph for us, all the parties, what they're called to each of the specific real estate contracts. So that's what I'm going to do in this video. So the way I got this set up is, here are the parties to a contract. We have the buyer, the seller or the owner, the lender, the third party, a tenant, and then whether or not the contract is a unilateral contract or a bilateral contract. Two real estate terms that you have to know, and you have to know what type of these contracts here, are they unilateral or bilateral? Now, just to kind of recap or review what that means, a unilateral contract means there is more than one party to the contract, but it's only binding on one party, but not the other. A bilateral contract is, once the contract is signed, it is enforceable by all the parties. It's binding on all parties to the contract. And one other thing before we get started, understand, and I've said this in many of the other videos here, we know that there are parties to the contract. For example, a buyer and a seller, but they all have legal names that we have to know. All right, and that's what we're talking about here. So let's take a look. So the first one we have is the offer to purchase. Now, when a buyer makes an offer on the property, they have a legal name. The seller is going to receive that offer. They have a legal name. All right, so the buyer is the offeror, O-F-F-E-R-O-R, the offeror, because they are the giver of the contract. And the seller is the offeree, E-R-E-E, with two E's. And a offer to purchase, it's an open contract, so it's really not a contract, so it's neither unilateral or bilateral at this point. Now, once the offer to purchase has been agreed to, meaning all the parties, the buyer and the seller have signed it, it becomes a purchase contract, and the purchase contract becomes legally enforceable on everybody, so we got to give them legal names, all right? So the buyer becomes the grantee, G-R-A-N-T-E-E, and the seller becomes the grantor. All right, and the reason they switched is here the buyer was the OR, giver of the contract, and the seller was the receivee. But once the contract is agreed to, the grantor, the seller, is giving the title, and the grantee is going to receive the title at the closing table. Now, purchase contract, once it's been agreed to, it is a bilateral contract. It's a bilateral contract because it is legally enforceable by all parties. So if one of the parties breaches, the other one could go into court and seek remedy. Land contract is another one. All right, so the vendor, V-E-N-D-O-R, the vendor is the owner, and the vendee with two E's is the person receiving the land contract, or the buyer. It's seller financing here, and this is for a different video, but a land contract is a type of seller financing. Now, the lender is the owner of the property, and this is a bilateral contract because once that land contract, or sometimes called a contract for deed, very important that you know the AKAs here, it is legally enforceable by all parties. All parties are expected to perform as the terms of the contract requires. Lease contract, all right, we have the owner, and the owner has a legal name that's called the lessor, and then the tenant is the lessee with two E's, and it is the lease contract is as well a bilateral contract. So once it's signed, then the tenant and the landlord are bound by the terms of it. An assignment of contract. An assignment of contract. Now, for the assignment of contract, we got two parties here. We have the buyer of the assignment. They are called the assignee with two E's. And the seller or giver of the contract, or the contract, is the assignor with OR. Now, this is for a different video as well, but I'm going to kind of briefly describe how this works. Anytime we have an assignment of contract, that means there's already some type of contract in place that's being assigned. Let's still look at a lease agreement, for example. The lease contract is between the owner or the landlord and the tenant. So the lease is held by the tenant. They are the owner of that lease contract. The owner of that lease contract, the tenant, can assign it to somebody else. And so what happens is the owner or giver of the assignment is the owner of that assignment. So the tenant would therefore be the owner of the assignment, so they are the assignor. And then the person, the subtenant, would be the assignee. Now, I did a video on this that outlined what I was talking about as far as lease contracts and assignment of a lease. That video really explains this concept really well. I'm going to put a video's link right up here in the upper right-hand corner of the screen here. You can click on that for more information. All right, mortgage. Mortgage, 2 terms you have to know for your real estate licensing exam. We have the buyer or the borrower, who is the mortgagor. Yes, OR, mortgagor. And the lender is the mortgagee with 2 E's. Now, I know it's a little confusing because you're saying, well, it's the lender who's giving the mortgage. I understand that, but in this role they flip. And you just have to know who is who here. And the way I remembered this when I was sitting where you are as a student, there are 2 E's in mortgagee and there are 2 E's in lender. That was my little shortcut that I used to remember these 2 terms. The next one I want to talk about is a deed of trust. Now, a deed of trust is actually going to have 3 players here. All right, the first one is called the Trustor. The Trustor, OR. And the lender is the beneficiary. And then the third party is the trustee. Now, I'm going to have a different video on how the deed of trust works. But just to kind of explain here is when the buyer closes on the house, what they're technically doing, they are the trustor. They're giving over the collateral to the third party, and the third party is going to hold that collateral until the note is paid off. And in case that note goes into default, if the borrower defaults, then the trustee, at the request of the bank, who's the beneficiary, they can then foreclose on the property. I'll explain that in a future video. For this video, though, I just want you to know who the different parties are. And then the last one I want to talk about here, oh, by the way, let's go back up here. Assignment of contract. It is a bilateral contract. It is a bilateral contract. A mortgage is a bilateral contract. And a deed of trust is a bilateral contract, because all of those contracts require that once they're agreed to and everybody signs, it's legally enforceable by all parties. The last one I want to talk about is a listing contract. Now, a listing contract is between the seller and the brokerage firm. It's a type of employment contract. And what it is it's a unilateral contract. All right? And there really is no legal terms that we have to know for the listing contract, but here's the thing. I did inquire to PSI, which is one of the testing companies. They will not ask a student whether or not a listing contract is a unilateral or a bilateral contract. And the reason is there is a lot of debate about this, and you can go to any principles and practice book, and let's say you read through 5 of them, you're going to get 2 or 3 different answers. Some of the books will tell you it's a unilateral contract, some will tell you it's a bilateral contract. Same thing in some of the law books. When I was doing the research for this, I read through about 3 or 4 different law books, and half of them said it was a unilateral contract and some said that it was a bilateral contract. But overall, if you were doing the averages, Most of them said they were unilateral. Another theory is it's unilateral up to the point that there's a purchase contract put in place, and then it's bilateral because at that point the seller is owed or owes a commission to the listing company. The point I wanted to make here for you as the student is you're not going to be asked on a test question whether or not a listing contract is unilateral or bilateral. So, having said that, this is the schematic for all the different parties to a contract and what's the parties' legal names.